that did not extinguish their own faith. And as they received Catholic instruction and Christian education, even of Protestant types, their own spirituality often grabbed hold of those forms and merged them into something that was unrecognizable to the priests, but quite familiar to the people that worshiped in that way. And so others from the outside, looking at this kind of strange amalgamation of Catholic saints and African spirits, named it voodoo and called it devil worship. But to the people who were practicing that faith, it was their understanding of their God and the way that they could get free. And so it's strange that Robertson and many other white Christian theologians at the time and since, and even historians, have concluded that the only way black slaves could gain their freedom was to make a deal with the devil. It begs the question, however, that if the slaves had to make a deal with the devil in order to get free, with whom did the slave owners make their deal in order to gain ownership of the slaves? I'm assuming that Robertson must not have the book of Exodus in his Bible. For if Robertson and the others had ever read Exodus chapter 3, it was the God of the Israelites that said to Moses, I have seen the misery of my people. I have heard their cries because of their slave masters. I have therefore come down to set them free. Right there in the Bible, it is the God that we worship that sets slaves free. So I don't know who they made their deal with. I don't know what God Robertson worships. Our prophet Elijah also heard from God. He stood on a mountainside, so the story goes. He stood there to meet God. But before he could meet God, there was a strong wind that blew. And the wind blew so strong that the side of the mountain cracked open and rocks were split. But God wasn't in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake that shook the whole place where he was standing. But God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was fire all around. But God was not in the fire. After the fire, after the wind, after the earthquake, there was the sound of sheer silence. The old King James Version calls it a still, small voice. So after the wind, after the fire, after the earthquake, was sheer silence. And in that silence, Elijah heard God's voice. And God spoke to Elijah, and what he said was, you are not alone. That was the word. So if we are looking for God in all of this, don't look in the earthquake, because God is not in the earthquake. Look for the victims. Think of the victims laying there under the rubble for days. I imagine if they knew this passage, that they would know that God had not rained down the rubble on their heads. They would know that God was not in the earthquake. And as they lay there after the earthquake, as they lay there in the silence, listening for God's voice, what did they hear? The tap, tap, tap of those who were searching for survivors. And those who were looking for survivors, they would stand around a building and they would say to everyone in all the cacophony of trucks and people and helicopters and all that was going on, they would say to them, shh, be quiet, listen. And those who were searching for the survivors, they would listen and they would hear the tap back from those who lay under the rubble. I submit to you that in that silence and in that exchange of taps, they heard God's voice. They found God in that aftermath. In the silence, they found God. And the taps and the cries and even the singing. There are reports that some of those who lay under the rubble, who had enough strength and will, comforted themselves by singing. And those who were searching for survivors would come upon this pile of rocks and rebar and roof tiles and rubbish, and underneath it all, they would hear singing from those seeking comfort in that pile of trash. I believe they heard God in that singing. The family members who are searching, they hear the voice of God when they hear their babies cry and dig down to find them. God is not in the earthquake, but God is in what happens as we respond to the earthquake. That's where you will find God. You know, I included the other story of Acts, where Paul and Silas have been put in jail for their preaching. And there they are with the other prisoners. And suddenly, an earthquake. And the earthquake threw open the prison doors. And when I've ever read that before, I've thought, ha ha, how funny. But we've heard the reports that even in Haiti, that the prison collapsed, and as a result, those who were not killed, those prisoners in fact did escape. So was God in the earthquake to let the prisoners go? Well, if you read the story in Acts, you know that Paul and Silas refused to take the opportunity to flee. So what that says to me is, whether in Kings or in Acts or in Haiti, an earthquake is just an opportunity for some people to do good and some people to do evil. And so those prisoners who have escaped and have returned to their gangster ways, and Pat Robertson, who has taken this opportunity of the earthquake to spew his hatred and nonsense and racism, they've chosen the opportunity of this earthquake to do evil. But I say that we have the opportunity to do good.